Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code, OmniPoke. For today's video, we have our first week of online tournament results in the Shrouded Fable format. We have 9 tournaments to look over today with over 100 players in attendance, so we can start getting a good grip on what the best performing lists look like going into the World Championships. We're starting with the Ditto Masquerade number 9. I think this was on the 1st of August, and we're going all the way up to the 7th of August today, just for context here. So there will be more tournaments to look at. Also, check out my Twitter, Omni_Joe, if you want to see some collated data of how these decks are performing. I've done cup points as well as regional points equivalent for these decks based on how many players are in all of these events, so it should give you a better picture of how the best decks are actually performing. Let's get in some deck specifics then, and the first tournament was won by Gardevoir, jumping straight off the NAIC success. But there's a really interesting choice here, and that's the A-Spec of Neutralization Zone coming into the list, preventing all damage done to Pokemon that don't have a rule box by attacks from your opponent's Pokemon EX and V. So there's already a Mimikyu in the list, and obviously we have Hit Point buff from Bravery Charm and Super Rod, so we do have that sort of defensive angle already available in Gardevoir. By the way, I think Mimikyu is a really decent shout right now. It's a good Pokemon to push against the Regidrago matchup because it can stop them taking multiple prizes in opening stages without having gusting effects. But also having this neutralization zone, I think, is also specifically very good against the Regidrago matchup, where oftentimes they play 1 stadium or 0 stadium. A lot of the lists we'll look at today don't play any stadium whatsoever, so you can have good confidence that simply putting down the zone means that then you can churro up your Gardevoir. There's 2 copies in this list, and then all of your Pokemon don't give up, can't be damaged, so yeah, you can just slowly chip away at them with whatever, really. So it's a very powerful option, and I think it does force Regidrago to probably play a stadium card. Some of the lists we'll look at this week won't have it incorporated, but with the threat of this neutralization zone, not only in Gardevoir, but possibly in some other archetypes as well that we'll look at, I think that's something to really bear in mind. I do like the TM devolution if you're expecting lots of Charizard and possibly some Dragapult EX at the World Championships. I do think Devo is very reasonable of an inclusion to give yourself that chance to not only pick up like Charizards themselves, but also Pidgeot EX most notably at the same time, so your opponent loses their engine in the mid-game after taking some aggressive early prizes. That's when you're feeling confident as Gardevoir that you can do a Devo strat alongside Iono as well. That's one of the big sort of comeback plays you can make in that matchup, as well as having, again, I suppose against Charizard, when they are likely playing 1 or 0 stadiums, oftentimes just the collapse stadium, the neutralization zone, if they can't Pidgeot for the card, can still be handy at buying you some more time as Guardy to maybe set up some damage, so that's something to bear in mind. I don't think it's guaranteed to be in Gardevoirs going into Worlds, but I do think it makes decks think, and it makes people commit extra slots, and I think for the first tournament of the season, I guess, it was a very smart choice just to come out and surprise some people. Next up we have Snorlax getting that 2nd place, and we have some really interesting inclusions here. As for new cards, we have the Xerosix Machinations, which has been becoming a mainstay in Snorlax lists as like a 1 to 2 count, where you force your opponent to discard cards from their hand until they have 3 cards remaining. You already do have decent access to your opponent's hand with the Eerie Supporter and the Misfortune Sisters, of course, but the Xerosix means that if your opponent is having like slower passing strategies, that's going to be massive for you. But it's also actually like pretty good in Mirror, where a lot of the time you're going to have to instant charge a bunch, and it's actually possible to like slowly whittle the opponent out of resources in mirror matches now, even without Chi-Yu. So I think it's much more likely that we won't see Chi-Yu EX in lists of Snorlax, unless you're really expecting mirror at Worlds. But this supporter is just a much neater option for that, where you can stop your opponent from holding on to too much, and it means that if they are just sort of drawing until they can Iono and reload 20 cards to the bottom of their deck again, trying to like waste your time, Xerosic puts an end to that really, which I think is important. Then we have the Pheasantipity EX coming into the list as well. I think this is kind of the most sus inclusion, because the whole idea around this archetype is that you're not giving up prize cards, but it can be used, I guess, to help you stabilize in the opening turns, but typically I don't think that's a big issue with the archetype. What I do really like, though, is the Night Stretcher. You're not playing energy anyway, so Super Rod doesn't like diminish too much in value. So having the Mimikyu that you can recover or having Ogerpons that you can use multiple of is pretty powerful. And I do think we have seen a big shift towards Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon as a card, simply because Charizard doesn't play enough respect for this card, especially now with Mimikyu being answered possibly by Dusknoir in the list. It's very likely that an army of Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon will just win out against Zard because they really don't have many good attacking options, especially for a list like this that can like slowly loop Penny. So yeah, I think Snorlax is a threat in the formats. The combination of handheld fan Snorlax is pretty good into like the Gardevoir matchup. You cover Charizard pretty nicely with Cornerstone. You do have answers with Mimikyu into the Regidrago matchup. Essentially, Drago, it's really based on like how they discard their cards of researches and their own V-Star power, of course. They are often going to play one copy of Cancelling Clone, so if you can snag that with an Eerie or a Misfortune Sisters, you're going to feel a lot more confident knowing that you can develop a board late on with Mimi sort of kind of just sitting there. Obviously, if you can loan Mimi in the active, they can't even Dragapult to sprinkle damage counters on it. So yeah, I think there's a lot of lines you can have with still some auto wins, so it's still certainly a dangerous archetype going forward. We then have Pidgeot EX, another like control build here. You can see doing pretty well here. It does have the 101 line of Charizard. I'd be very sus of 60 hit point Charmanders and pretty sus of 50 hit point Pidgey, honestly. And even the Cleffer. There are some inclusions that I don't think match up too well here, but the core concept of a Pidgeot control deck that has aggressive angles with Charizard does still seem reasonable. Rather than having the Ursaluna, you've got Radzard still in the list, and the Charizard EX can still be that sort of late game sweeper. Hero's Cape is interesting in Charizard, actually just like a normal Charizard, to be honest, because a lot of the time Regidrago is looking to use Ogerpon against you for one-hit KOs, and I've seen it pop up not just in controlling Zards, but every now and then in some Pidgeot Zard, like some straightforward lists. Hero's Cape could be pretty reasonable to keep yourself out of range of an Ogerpon, and I think that's something worth exploring possibly, especially with Unfair Stamps sometimes diminishing in value with oftentimes Pheasantipity EX established on board for a number of decks. But yeah, this is similar to like some EUIC builds where we have a combination of like Luxray, which can take cards out of the opponent's hand, as well as the Eerie supporter. You're trying to tank a little bit. What I will say is that like stuff like Luxray Bravery Charm or like Defiance Vest or whatever else you have, I think that's a lot more vulnerable, specifically into Charizard, because they can Dusknoir you now. So I do think it is more risky to have this like basic sponge approach, other than like the Ogerpon and the Mimikyu, which I suppose are just still good enough. So maybe this deck just has enough individual answers that it's still okay. But yeah, I wouldn't write off Pidgeot Control. We'll have a look at some other lists as well. There are some more like Zero-6 Machination focus ones as well that we'll get into later. So it seems like Pidgeot is still kind of around for those who still love playing the archetype. We have another Gardevoir, again playing the Devo, playing 3 Darkness Energy in this list. Sticking with the Klefki, I want to know your thoughts on Klefki, really. I think a lot of the time it's a wave going towards double Flutter main much more commonly. I think you're always playing these two spaces. It's whether you play 2 Flutter or just that 1-1 split, because Klefki is risky into the Drago, right? You shut them down a lot more effectively, but also you probably have to play like 2 Churro or maybe a Collapsed in the list to get it off your board so they can't punish you with Gust into Kieran plays. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. The Flutter gets like way less punished, but is also like way less powerful, I suppose, of an ability locker. But you have the upside of it synergizing with Devo as well. So I've kind of been more towards 2 Flutter than a 1-1 split as of late, but I think there are reasons to play both, and I still need to play more of the Drago into Guardi matchup without like the neutralization zone and stuff. We see a Raging Bolt deck, interestingly playing Lost City. I think I'm still happiest with just Pokestops in the list, but I suppose this is a way to stop a Mimikyu for good with a Sandy Shocks play, perhaps. Incorporating the Night Stretcher, which I think is a great card in the list, as well as the Pheasantipity EX, which is like a no-brainer in the 60 as well. This list isn't playing Mew EX, so it still just has the Fez. I think it is not unreasonable to play one of each of Fez, Squawk, and Mew, but bench space is of course tight, and you still want to commit a lot to just the Ogerpon themselves to reach those one-hit KOs. Interesting that it's still got the Lost Vacuum in the 60. I suppose the Guardi players are still going aggressive with Bravery Charm against you. I guess the Lost City is also pretty good against Guardi, just generally, not just at slowing down Mimikyu and giving you a constant answer. Certainly an interesting list. Still has a lot of speed behind it. Still has some catches in there. Yeah, not terrible. I think Raging Bolt's going to be very much like a add Pheasantipity, add Night Stretcher, and you're done, basically. So That's going to be something we see running throughout. We have a Lugia doing pretty well. This is just a cookie cutter Lugia, and again, no shame in that whatsoever. I think the only standout card is the Wellspring Ogerpon. It's like the tech inclusion in the list, and there's the debate of Jamming Tower versus Mesagoza. But yeah, the Wellspring, you know why it's in there, right? You want to have more avenues to take early 2-prize KOs, and obviously bench damage is a very aggressive way that you can deal with the board as well as initiate a prize race. We have some interesting Iron Thorns stuff going on. I think this is one of the only lists of Iron Thorns where we have Crowns and Thorns. Oftentimes it's just the Quad Thorns, but we'll also see some Cornerstone Thorns in here as well. But this is trying to push the damage output of Iron Thorns that little bit more, which I think is certainly interesting, so that you're not like whiffing on KOs here and there if you're like whiffing early future booster energy capsules or whatnot. But I do think there is a place for Iron Thorns in this metagame. Its ability is just very powerful right now with the archetypes currently in formats where we're expecting Lugia. The Regidrago matchup certainly doesn't appreciate this plus hammers, and if you're playing Giovanni's the one that allows you to attach and then discard one guaranteed off the opponent, I think there is something there with just a more heavy energy disruption build of Iron Thorns. So we'll look at more Thorns as well later on. There is a Gholdengo, also gains a couple cards, again, similar to the Raging Bolts, where Pheasantipede is great, synergizes really nicely with Cypher. That's why we see that higher count of Cypher now, even more than the Iridate in the list. Not sure about the split here, but I do think Cypher just gains more value now that you can pop off turn 1 with Greninja, and then throughout the game with coin bonuses as well as Pheasantipede. But yeah, the Night Stretcher also just a really nice inclusion alongside your Pokestops. When you play so many one-off Pokemon, it's great, but also just reloading Goldengos if they get hit with Pokestop. This gives you even more access to those sorts of cards, especially because Ultra Ball is like a painful card to use in the deck, because you normally use your discard synergy cards on superiors. So now having a Nightly Stretcher, as long as a Gholdengo is like milled, that's also really, really good for you for like sustainability. So I do think this deck gets a little bit better in a vacuum. I still think it's just a bit too slow out the gate at actually reaching that initial KO. I think that's still the biggest issue I've faced with the archetype. I did test it a lot though with Pheasantipede. The only issue is that it's still like a retroactive card, right? If they only take the 1-prize KO on Gimmighoul, you're laughing, because then you come in with Gholdengo, you Fez, then you coin bonus a bunch, and you're taking 2 prizes every turn. That's great. But because the Regidrago matchup and the Lugia matchup are so good at taking their first prizes in multiple, you know, they can either Dragapult or they can Kyurem or they can Iron Hands, and their first prizes that they're taking are going to be 2, right, at least. So that's what's awkward for the Gholdengo. You can't really be the proactive deck, which is a problem for some of those other V-Star matchups. But that's our first top 8. Let's get into the Battle Park, where we have James Cox's Regidrago list. Now, this one I am obsessed with. I really think James has nailed the 60, to be honest with you. You are playing just 2 boss, which does make me a little bit queasy. But every other card inclusion I like so much from James here, to be honest with you. I think if you're trying desperately to find a space, I think it's allowed with the Night Stretcher in the list to go down to 7 grass or 2 fire. I think you are allowed to make 1 energy cut from this list, and that's if you're looking to fit in something like a Goodra, an extra Regidrago, an extra copy of that Boss's Orders, or just another card that you're thinking about. But I really like the Dragon Attacking Suites. I think the Tina V-Star, the Dragapult as the 2 count, and the Kyurem, those are locked in. I personally lean towards Goodra, so I think it is worthwhile right now because it's very good into the Mirror Match. It's solid into Lugia, it's solid into Raging Bot as well, where it's hard for them to chain those monster KOs, and just makes life a little bit more awkward for them, because obviously Goodra, even though it's not taking KOs, it sets you up for like a Gust Phantom Dive play on a future turn for like a 4-prize swing. So yeah, I think James has absolutely nailed this list. As you can see, he was playing a Stadium card. This might easily be a knee-jerk reaction to the option of the Neutralization Zone from the previous day from Gardevoir, but I think Sinnoh is the perfect choice, actually. You can play Pokestop for a bit more consistency, which I would never question, but because Lugia is a high-profile bad matchup, I do think the Sinnoh is really valuable here as well. So hats off to James. He's like a crazy strong player, tests a bunch, and you can see it in the list here, having a great tournament run, and I think that is pretty much the gold standard Drago that I would look towards if you're still trying to like test that archetype. I think that's built really, really well. We then have another Snorlax. As you can see, this one is playing still the elevated count of Ogerpon, the Stretchers and the Machinations come into the list. I think the very heavy handheld fan is also becoming like very, very commonplace. I will skip through lists if they're just not too much to note, if they're decks I've already talked about too much, and we'll look at the outliers. One very cool thing about this Raging Bolt, however, is that it played 4 copies of Night Stretcher. I think the ratios are a bit off here. You surely have to play a third Pokestop if you're going that high on Night Stretcher, because at that point, you're basically using the Stretcher as like pseudo Ball Search. Like, this is obviously in the place of Ultra Ball to some extent, as well as Trekking Shoes in the high counts. So just lean into that. Just play, like, if you're going that high on Stretcher, you just go like 3 or 4 stop, right? That's kind of like the whole thing you're working towards here, but I do think it's a cool idea. Stuff like the second copy of Power Pad as well. Everything is just screaming out the fact that you should be playing an extra Pokestop in this list. Another kind of interesting build of the Drago where it's incorporating the Iron Leaves EX. This one's been a topic of big debate, actually, because it was played in the like World's Testing Japanese tournament, where this can allow you to have some aggressive turn 1 attacking plays going second. Much more easy to get this powered up into the active by yoinking energy off your Ogerpon and getting that swing in with Prism Edge, compared to like spending your E-switches onto a Regidrago, which may not be able to tank, for example. So if you spend those resources, then you're basically committing yourself to V-Star, back E-switches later. Whereas this is something you can just like send on in there, knowing that you can still manually attach, you know, in the best case scenario to a Regidrago that turn as well. But what's I think is really cool is that you could either initiate a prize race, or you could just punch another chunky 2-prizer, setting up a Regidrago for a future turn with Dragapult if you have gusting plays. I do have some issues with this card. The good news about it compared to like just a physical switch in the list is that it can't be hit with Eerie or Misfortune Sisters, so you know you're guaranteeing a switching effect in some controlling matchups. And this is just very reliable against Charizard, which is going to be obviously like a hand-disrupting deck, so I do think it's important to have this card in here. Otherwise, you have to be much more cautious with your Ogerpon, how you're splitting up your energy throughout the entire game. But I do think that just generally your board is still going to be full of Dragos, Ogerpon, Pheasantipede, and sometimes, you know, you've had to Squawk or put Mew into play as well. So I think there's not always times where the Leaves is live. And for that reason, I'm still kind of team Switch, to be honest with you. But I think it's pretty close. There was a Lost Zone Giratina Soldier still out there with just a pretty standard list, to be honest, actually playing no new cards whatsoever. So yeah, sticking with old faithful deck, still getting the job done. This Drago list played some other really interesting cards. It had the Thornton in here, so you can, again, fix your board if you have some annoying Pokemon that you've put into play. You can try and use this to fix your board if you've started like a Kyurem or an Iron Leaves or something and throw it in the bin. Sometimes there's even niche lines where you can like get rid of your Hawlucha, then Legacy Star it back and reuse your flying entry. And you'll also see the attacking suite is really interesting. They have the Haxorus for the 230 damage output option into some basic 2-prizes, and you have the Raging Bolt that can push way above that 280 as well, so you can push into the Gardevoirs more reasonably, and you can get around V-guarded Lugias. I think the cost of Raging Bolt is pretty high, but I do think it's important to note that there are some archetypes out there which really are hoping that the Drago is just playing Giratina and that they can tank in certain situations. We've got to that point where Regidrago is so popular and worth attacking against that maybe a wave back towards Raging Bolt is the right thing to do for the World Championships. The only thing you have to bear in mind is that you probably do have to play cards like Thornton or Scoop Up Cyclone in the list, which has its own downsides, compared to playing the Giratina V-Star, which can never find its way into the active position, of course. Another pretty interesting build of Gardevoir, we have the Pheasantipede and Tatsugiri combo. I think there is big downside with Fez, to be honest with you. Even though this is a deck that likes to just naturally cycle, I think the Gardevoir is normally quite tanky into a number of matchups, so giving the opponent that easy out of a boss 2-prize play with the Fez down, I think is a big downside. So I'm still preferring Greninja to both of these cards, actually, but it is interesting to see just how versatile the Fez really is. There was a really interesting Arceus deck, and there might be a couple Arceus decks that we look at today, actually, where it has that thick barrel line, and it has just some annoying Pokemon in here. The Ogerpon once again showing up, Spiritomb to shut down lots of V Pokemon, certainly could be helpful into the controlling matchups, so just denying their draw power. And as we know, Blood Moon Ursaluna, a very powerful card. You've got the Eerie in here, you've got the Machinations, just a lot of the disruption package coming into the 60, jamming towers in high counts as well to help out against Gardevoir, and just deny Forest Hill Stone from decks. Yeah, really interesting disruptive arc. Let's not forget, with so many decks kind of like over-teching right now, Judge in the early game is still very detrimental to a lot of archetypes, especially when you have your own Starburst and Barrel to fall back on. Then we come to the big one, the Tournament of Doom World Championships. This was like a 300-player tournament, and it was won by something very interesting. This deck went 8-0, mind you. It's an Ogerpon EX Weirdeer variant, where you really are just either attacking with Teal Mask itself, or you're just littering energy around your board so you can commit with a Psychic Bash from a Weirdeer V into the active position. You even have some double turbo energy in here as well, and you're utilizing a 2-1-1 line of the Dusknoir of all things, because the deck is just playing all the good two-prize engine Pokemon, so your opponent basically always ignores the fact that there is a Dusknoir available in the list, because it wouldn't help their prize race, but it might be able to help you. If you initiate a prize race into a single prize Pokemon with like an Ogerpon, for example, you can then Dusknoir another single prizer later down the line, and at that point you're hoping that things like Blood Moon, Ursaluna, or Weirdeer can reach one-hit KOs on other two prizes that are littered around the opponent's board. It's actually very cool to combine Dusknoir in aggressive archetypes, because you do really enjoy condensing the game down to as few turns as possible. You have the Fezandipiti EX and the Mew EX to really not worry too much about Iono whatsoever. And it's also a really interesting use of the Arven package, again, just for more consistency really, where the Luminion unlocks the Forest Stone, Bravery Charm can allow you to tank with some of your early basic EXs or Vs. Whenever you get a Weirdeer tanking, that's going to be a huge deal. And this deck is quite different to the other like aggressive two-prize archetypes in format right now, where you're not really tied to that Sada so much, so you can more freely boss's orders and use that Iono as well in those matchups. So yeah, actually a really cool archetype. I certainly need to play more with this deck, but it certainly turns some heads, the fact that this is done pretty well. You do have naturally decent type coverage into Charizard. The Dusknoir really can make things a little bit more tricky for the opponent, especially with the rare candy in the mix as well. So overall, very, very cool 60, and I think it really did highlight the fact that Dusknoir could actually be really good in an all two-prize deck, because the opponent basically always ignores it and it's a win-win for you. With the 7-1 record, we have Ancient Box in here as well, incorporating the new Pecharunt EX, allowing you to simply just beat control, really, to be honest with you. This allows you to just shift into your Roaring Moon that little bit more effectively. I suppose it can give you upside into just like leading Fluttermane, and it means you don't insta-lose the game if you led your Great Tusk. I'm also kind of intrigued by the idea of having Fezandipiti EX in this list as well, because one of the only real downsides of this archetype is that you're very, very reliant on Radiant Greninja. So the possibility of getting like ahead enough in a prize race to pop down a late game Fez does sound interesting to me. Also very surprising that it plays just one copy of Countercatcher and one Iron Bundle, no boss whatsoever. So it could be that the Pecharunt literally only comes out to play for one matchup and is otherwise just fodder in most situations. There was a Lost Zone box that went 6-1-1. Pretty interesting to see the incorporation of Cornerstone Ogerpon EX. Again, just more of a nod to Charizard. If you're wondering how this archetype gets around Regidrago, I don't know, because it didn't face any Drago in day one, and that could be why it had a decent tournament run. I have heard mutterings of like double Manaphy coming into some Lost Zone boxes, I suppose. It is eating up space, both on board and in deck, but I suppose that is a way for you to not be so concerned about the Cologne Kieran plays from other matchups. I also wanted to highlight this kind of approach with the Lost Zone deck as well, where you're just trying to unlock Mirage Gate for yourself, and then you're playing just multi-prizes instead. And this is another way that you can safeguard yourself against Kyurem in a different way, really, where you'll only have like 2 Comfey down, so they can take a 2-prize KO already on your multi-prizes, or they can Kyurem from double Comfey and have a big discard. We know the combination of Iron Hands, Roaring Moon is very strong from the past, and that combination only gets more secure with the Fezandipiti EX also on board, because you can have more late game guarantees of drawing back into your rods, gates, and just turn attachment combinations. To be honest with you, if I was going to be looking at the Lost Zone box variants, these are the kind of lists that I actually really gravitate towards. Basically ignore the option of Sableye altogether, even though it's a very powerful card, because I do think this will have the much better time into the Regidrago matchup, and just has immense speed and consistency at its side. It's kind of hard to ignore, I think. Going on to the next event, the winning Drago list somehow found space for 2 Pokemon Catcher. I need to lie down. I don't think I'd ever make the space for Pokemon Catchers in this deck. You already have Prime Catcher and ways to recover Prime Catcher from your own V-Star power. I think we lean into that more than anything else here. There was also an Entei Iron Valiant deck with the Carmines in here for just extra aggressive options. You do have that like Magma Basin Jet Energy combination where you can still ping off a number of things early with Tachyon bits and have aggressive options from the Entei V itself. I haven't played around with this archetype for like a decent amount of time, but I suppose Entei Valiant Bibarel was being discovered in the previous format, so I guess it hasn't really changed too much. More Lugia lists, I am definitely a big fan of Iron Bundle right now. I personally, going into Worlds, take the L to a Quad Thorns. I think, like, if you just run into Quad Thorns, or, like, more than one of them, you just say it wasn't your year to win. Because Iron Bundle is just far better in so many other matchups that I think this is a way less wasted spot than a Fluttermane would be. So I'm definitely a big Iron Bundle stan right now. The Ogerpon once again shows up in this deck list. Maybe it is just worthwhile having even more threats at your disposal for multi-prize turns, and forcing those opponents to respect you in an open deck list situation to develop that Manaphy may just deny a little bit of setup here and there. And also making the top 8, we have a throwback to the Roaring Moon deck with the Water E-Switch package for Greninja, and having Darkrai V-Star as your means of recovery. The list does have Cancelling Clone and enough like Prime and Switch cards to probably cause headache to some Snorlax players, and that's actually really popular in the online spaces right now, so having that V-Star power would be very annoying for them to come up against. I'm surprised to see no Night Stretcher in here. I feel like it would be really, really good in a list like this with so many one-off Pokemon and 4 Pokestop. Sunny's weekly was won by a quad Iron Thorns. Like I said, a bit more focused on like hand and energy disruption here. Has the Giovanni's Charisma, has the handheld fan, is playing 3 copies of the Eerie, as well as 3 copies of the new Colress's Tenacity, a really strong supporter card that comes into this list because you can guarantee double turbo energy as well as Locity. It's another one of these cards that really just helps you keep ticking over. I'm surprised to see Prime over Legacy energy, but I suppose with that Arven synergy, you just have so much access to take out threats as soon as they hit the board and Locity them for good. Little quick cameo for Gholdengo that got a 2nd place finish with Hyper Aroma coming into the deck list, also having the Cologne in this 60 with Silene as a combo so that you can wall break when you need to. A very, very interesting Monkey Dory Frostlass with the old Okidogi, the Adrena Power Okidogi that can deal 170 for 2 energy and has 230 hit points on a single prize Pokemon, and the new single prize Blood Moon Ursaluna that has the battle hardened ability, which means you can instantly attach 2 fight energy from hand to this Pokemon, which means you're just 1 attachment away from the Mad Bite attack, which does 100 plus 30 more for each counter on your opponent's active Pokemon. The obvious synergy here is that you have the Freezing Shroud and Adrena Brain to help out. You weave those in the opening stages, get as much damage into play as possible, knowing that as you get towards the late game with your Luminous and Legacy energy, you can do so much with your Radiant Charizard and Blood Moon Ursaluna EX. It's also crazy to see a list that plays 2 copies of Turbo Energize and Devolution as well. So much going on here, a lot of fun, no doubt. Not sure if I have time to explore this one before the World Championships though. This is another really, really interesting one. We have a 4-4-4 line of Dusknoir with Hyper Aroma as the ace spec, trying to blast our way through our opponent's board and then get into the Blood Moon Ursaluna range as quickly as possible. A Bravery Charm Blood Moon is such a headache for so many archetypes, and it's a very dangerous attacker, as we know. You can see there's 4 Penny in the list as well, so archetypes that can't hit 310 damage means you can pick up the Blood Moon, go into the next one, and swing once again. I love seeing an explosive, aggressive archetype like this, because having just so many Dusclops on turn 2 is going to make you pretty reasonable into some of these evolving decks, because you can just naturally remove so much all in one go. And because some of the aggressive, like 2-prize decks, can't actually deal with the tanky Blood Moon very early on in the game, especially when you're spamming Countercatcher Iono, dealing with their engine Pokemon and putting them down to those low hand sizes. Another one that I definitely have to explore. The more and more I'm seeing it, Dusknoir works so well with all 2-prize packages. It's definitely something that I think could be unlocked at Worlds. There was also a Toadscruel EX Ogerpon deck that got top 8 as well, has the Legacy energy in here, has the 1-1 line of Kricketune to make your guys a little tankier. You do have the Slime Mold Colony Toadscruel that can stop your opponent getting cards back from the discard pile, an obvious nod towards the Regidrago V-Star matchup, which is quite funny. Yeah, very kooky deck. I don't know if it's Toadscruel's time. I think there's better Ogerpon decks, but cool to see it shine as well. We have a very, very teched out Regidrago that did actually go 8-0 here. It's playing Tina, Gudra, the double Dragapult, the Kieran, which I'm a big fan of, but it's also playing Noivern EX and Haxorus in the list, and it's somehow also got the space for Mew, Fez, and Squawk. I think there's oftentimes people just playing like 2 of the 3, and wouldn't you know, it's also snuck in the Churro scenario in here, as well as the Switch Prime Catcher. Somehow they've just made the space for everything. There was a Dragapult Pidgeot incorporating the Dusknoir in 2nd place. There's also the Radiant Alakazam in the deck list to just have so much control over your opponent's bench, of course. The 50 hit point Pidgey does make me a little nervous, but other than that, I do think this is a solid build of the Dragapidge. Seems like more and more people are taking note of a thin Dusknoir line coming into the multi-prize builds, where Miraidon has now taken the initiative and added it to their 60. Similar to Mike Gibbs's NAIC list, where it plays a very thin line of supporters and just relies on ability draw instead, becomes even more reliable with Pheasantipity EX as well coming into the list, which I do think is very cool. There's also the Academy at Night Stadium as well, which can manipulate our top decks, which is obviously helping out against Electro Generator and banking some cards on top of our deck to help us out against Hand Disruption. How did they do it? How did they find space for 4 stage 2s in one deck? I'll never know, but this madman had a pretty solid run with it. We know the combination of Charizard and Dragapult is just pretty powerful inherently, and Dusknoir just has even more applications when you include the Dragapult as an attacking threat as well. The supporter line definitely makes me nervous, and you have had to cut corners all over the place, but you have so many threats in this deck that you can be a problem for all sorts. Then we come to All Out Blitzel's take on Pidgeot control in the new format. He's been testing a Luxray EX build with Zerosix Machinations, definitely a hand control style approach here. Radiant Gardevoir's in the list to try and protect your Pidgeot against the Regidrago V-Star. The Neo Upper Energy is a really cool inclusion as well, so you have more aggressive means of attacking with Luxray EX with its second attack here, the Volt Strike, to deal 250 damage. That's a great way if you just get through some annoying Pokemon. Of course, there's also the Roseanne's backup, so you can immediately reload the Neo Upper to turn on the aggression when you want to. The Charizard Pidgeot has won one of these big majors as well, a 9-1 record for a build that looks pretty straightforward, to be honest with you. It has got Temple of Sinnoh in the list to respect the Lugia matchup, and has one copy of Cancelling Clone to help you wall break a little bit more in the list. And if you haven't heard me spewing about Nespal, I absolutely adore it in this format. I love seeing elevated counts right now. With the inclusion of Pheasantipity EX in the list, you just have much more reliable means of getting early Rotom, which is great, but also having mid-game search for Radzard and Fez is so good for keeping you drawing cards or having that late-game attacking threat. Lugia came in second, and we have seen some more people filling the Cinccino down, even to as low as 2-2. This is just a 3-2 line, but has squeezed in the Weirdeer V. I do think this is an interesting one to have right now, because so often your opponent is proactively taking out your chops. It means that the energy that you have put around the board can still be utilised by Weirdeer for big one-hit KOs. And once again, we're seeing the bundle, which I definitely approve of right now. We're seeing another single prize Blood Moon Ursaluna attacking deck as well, this time using Iron Valiant as the means of pinging Pokemon down for the Mad Bite. Also adding in the Lana's Aid so that you can recover a lot of the Blood Moon and put it straight back into play, which is cool, alongside the Quad Nightly Stretcher as well, which just seems to have great synergy with Pokestop. I'm loving this as a mini package in this new format. This time we have another Miraidon, not incorporating the Dusknoir this time around, but still has the new inclusion of Academy at Night as a one-off count. Vitality Band can help with some map fixing. I know that's pretty good with Raichu to help with Gardevoir EX. That can also be nice for Miraidon for dealing with 230 hit point basics. It's also cool to see the Cypher Maniac in here as well. It does synergize with Mew, Radiant Greninja, Pheasantipity EX now, and even can allow you to just have more generator hits, which I also think has some cool utility. Interestingly, a kind of like no thrills Charizard also did pretty well, just incorporating Fez from the new set, having cards like E-Hammer to respect Lugia, having Cancelling Clone to respect the controlling matchups as well as Kieran Churro Pad, having Jamming Tower and Lost Vacuum in here as well. Yeah, lots of respect to lots of matchups. It is incredible how much space you gain by cutting that Dusknoir. Another pretty cheeky Dragapult build incorporating 2 copies of Nightly Stretcher and Silene in the list as well. Not much synergy here apart from Fez, but I do think that's a cool one. An Arceus Charizard V-Star with a Liepard engine and Pheasantipity also made top 8 at one of these tournaments. I guess Judge and Iono are really just that strong to get set up with Arceus. Yeah, pretty wild one, no doubt. What a way to end our World Championships little pre-review here in the first week of the Shrouded Fable format. Some really interesting lists. Let me know your thoughts about them down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.